The war on Labour's so-called rebels continues. 7 Labour MPs have now either been suspended or sanctioned, largely for their vocal opposition to Starmer's welfare cuts. Among the suspended are Lower and Grangemouth MP Brian Leishman, North East Hertfordshire MP Chris Hinchliffe, Poole MP Neil Duncan-Jordan, and York Central MP Rachel Maskell. All but one of the suspended MPs are new, having been in their post for just over 1 year. One, Rachel Maskell, has been an MP for a decade, and another, Neil Duncan-Jordan, was the first Labour MP to ever win the solidly Tory Poole constituency. It's therefore deeply ironic that given Starmer's tack to the right has been justified as necessary to win voters over from Reform and the Tories, he is going after one of the few MPs who was able to actually win a constituency that has always been comfortably Conservative. It's almost as if Starmer's three-dimensional chess electoral strategy that none of us could possibly understand was just a front for good old ideological disdain for the poor, the disabled, and party democracy. 3 other MPs who spoke against the bill, Rosina Allen-Khan, Bel Ribeiro Addy, and Mohammed Yassin, have also had their trade envoy roles revoked. All sanctioned and suspended MPs were one of the 47 who voted against the government's proposed cuts to welfare, forcing the government to U-turn on the most unpopular parts of the proposal, including the cuts to winter fuel allowance. The sanctioned MPs overwhelmingly represent the position not just of Labour voters, but of the broader public, particularly when it comes to cuts to disability benefits and pensioner support. So this graph shows YouGov polling on Starmer's original proposal for disability benefit. You can see there that 40% of Britons opposed the original plan, with voters from every party other than the Conservatives being against the changes. That includes 40% of Reform UK voters who Starmer says he is trying to court. Even cuts-happy Wes Streeting admitted that the U-turn on the welfare bill has put Labour in a better position as it removes one of the biggest liabilities with voters. So why is it that instead of thanking these rebel MPs for saving Labour's reputation with the public, Starmer is punishing them? It all comes down to the fact that, as far as I can see it, Starmer is an incredibly insecure leader. Deep down, he knows he doesn't have a strong and convincing set of principles to guide him, and he doesn't have a political identity that resonates with the public. Despite securing that landslide victory, he in many ways won on a technicality, on the basis that the Tories were so deeply unpopular and had basically run out of road. And the pitch he made to the public was very thin on concrete details. He didn't oppose the Tories strongly on policy or politics. Instead, he just presented himself as a more competent and professional alternative to Conservative chaos. So his favourability ratings are, as you can imagine, now extremely low at minus 44 points, according to YouGov. And whilst ratings do tend to dip as time goes on, Starmer's are still comparatively low for any leader at this point. But also, his were never that high to begin with. Even when he won with that stonking majority, it was almost in spite of him rather than because of him. Just a few months after his election, Starmer suffered the biggest post-election fall in approval ratings of any British Prime Minister in the modern era. And a lot of this is because the public don't see Starmer as trustworthy. This poll from YouGov shows that as the public have gotten to know Keir Starmer more and more, they've trusted him less and less. And whilst it's not necessarily unusual that the public don't trust a politician, it's certainly not helped by the fact that Starmer has consistently broken promises throughout his political career, whether it's misrepresenting his political agenda to Labour Party members during the leadership election in 2020, or him implementing the very policies he claimed to oppose during Tory rule. And that insecurity is making Starmer one of the most anti-democratic prime ministers in living memory. One Labour aide told Labour List that the latest round of suspensions was part of a, quote, heads on spikes strategy, intended to be a warning shot to other MPs not to rebel against the party, even if it means betraying promises they made to their constituents. And frankly, it's not a good look for Labour that as people are struggling to pay their bills, Starmer seems to be spending more time disciplining his own party for standing up for their voters than tackling the bread and butter issues that most of us are facing. And that is precisely the dilemma these newly suspended MPs are facing. Neil Duncan Jordan, for example, said this. Since being elected, I have consistently spoken up for my constituents on a range of issues, including most recently on cuts to disability benefits. I understood this could come at a cost, but I couldn't support making disabled people poorer. Rachel Maskell also commented that she, quote, could not be more committed to the Labour Party, having been a member for more than 34 years. But here she is on Sky News explaining why she could not support the government's cuts to disability.
Well, when the evidence was so strong that people would die as a result of these changes, having money taken away from them, people we know have serious mental health challenges, and we've got to protect those people in our society. I believe that. So I could not have on my conscience something where we know that people would take their own lives if they had insufficiency. And I spoke to my constituents because, like I reach into Downing Street and ministers here, I reach out into my constituents. And I met many disabled people who basically said their dignity was being taken from them, their very ability to provide was being taken. Even one person I spoke in the debate so passionately about, a constituent whose little girl was next to him, and he said, I just won't be here. So of course I'm going to speak up for those people who are voiceless if I did not. So that's why I make the statements that I do and really hold by that.
Super powerful statement there from Rachel Maskell. And again, I think it's incredibly insulting that whilst people are having to go to their MPs to say, you know, the idea of having my PIP taken away from me makes me feel like I can't go on. And then when they open the newspapers, when they log on to, you know, BBC News, they're just seeing Keir Starmer wasting all this time, spending all this time fighting his own MPs. I mean, it's really, and it's funny that the pitch that he did to win the election was very much about, you know, the Conservatives are in shambles, they're in chaos, they're too busy dealing with internal party politics in order to really focus on the British public. And it's been just over a year, and it feels like for absolutely no reason, Keir Starmer is doing exactly the same. Even that one thing that he, you know, really set the identity of his political career on, he can't even deliver that. Within the Labour Party, there has been a somewhat divided reaction to this latest round of suspensions. Labour National Executive Committee member Abdi Douale posted this on X. If you were elected as a Labour candidate, it shouldn't be shocking that voting with the Labour whip is a bare minimum requirement. Another MP told Labour List this: a few too many MPs seem to think their job is being an activist rather than actually governing. I thought that MPs should think that their job is delivering on at least some of the promises that they were elected on. But apparently that's just naive of me. I was joined earlier by one of these suspended MPs. Brian Leishman was elected as the Labour MP for Alloa and Grangemouth in 2024 and now sits as an independent MP following his suspension after he opposed the disability cuts. I began by asking Brian to outline what led to his suspension.
I voted against the government on the welfare bills because what we need to do after 14 years of austerity is really, really transform the country. And that means building a caring and compassionate society that looks after some of the most disabled and vulnerable people in it. We've seen over 14 years of Tory rule, real terrible things happen to the disabled community. And we've got to do something different. We talk about being a party of change. We got elected on that premise last year. And really, Tory austerity, Labour austerity, the bottom line is it is still austerity. So absolutely, I did not become a Labour Party member in 2016 and then a Labour councillor in 2022 and then a Labour MP last year to make people worse off, whether that be in Alloa and Grangemouth or right across the country. So in regard of the second part of your question there about interactions, I was disciplined. I received my first disciplinary really on the back of the WASPy 10-minute rule bill that I co-sponsored and then voted for. I've been out campaigning with WASPy women and stood on platforms with them. And if we're going to say one thing in opposition, then we really should be delivering on that in government. And that is a historical injustice that WASPy women have suffered. And then on Tuesday, I was in the welfare and also the taxes debate, the Tory opposition motion that they brought on Tuesday. So at 6:10, I received an email from the Chief Whip's office asking for me to meet him the next day at 12:45. I responded and said, yep, absolutely, after PMQs, I'll be there. And yeah, 12:45 came round. And after about probably a 10-15 minute conversation with the Chief, I was informed that I will be having a temporary suspension.
When you got that email and you knew that you were going in for a meeting with the Chief Whip, did you imagine that this is how it might have ended?
It was a real bolt from the blue, to be honest. I wasn't expecting to have a temporary suspension. It was said that I will be having an investigation done, carried out by the Chief, in respect of some of the comments that I've made in Parliament and also in the media, where I have been critical of the government, and also, some of the stances that I've taken. And apparently, I've broken the whip a dozen times, and that's not what the government want.
I mean, you kind of mentioned also in your first answer there that the Labour Party were elected on the premise of change, and certainly a lot of the opposition, when Labour was in opposition, a lot of the basis of that opposition was against Tory austerity. Why do you think Starmer and Reeves have seemed to turn on that promise so strongly in the first year of being in government?
I think it's only fair to say that, yes, we have inherited an absolute shambles, financial shambles from the Tories, and we do have to plug those gaps. But ultimately, I've always said, and I've said this 2 or 3 times in the chamber now, when politicians talk about tough choices, it always seems to be working class communities, the length and breadth of the United Kingdom, that seem to suffer from that. Now, people might point the finger and say I'm being ideological in what I'm about to say. And I admit I am being ideological about it, because instead of having money spent on nuclear weapons, that, to be honest, we've already got enough nuclear weapons. We don't need any more. If there's money for nuclear weapons and instruments of death and destruction, then why is there not money to build hospitals and to basically improve our education system? And let's even, again, let's say MRI scanners, CAT scanners, things that can be used to build and create a healthy society. Where's the money for that? That's the tough choices that, to be honest, we're getting wrong.
You're, of course, not the only person, not the only MP to have voted against these disability cuts. You were one of 47 MPs to do so, but just 7 of you were targeted for suspension or sanction. Do you think there's a particular reason why you and the other 6 were singled out, or do you think it was somewhat random?
Well, I don't know if it was random, but again, I think, to be honest, I couldn't second guess what the motivations for the leadership this decision has been. But what I will say is, when we look at the 3 other MPs that have been suspended, myself, Neil and Chris are all 2024 intake. Perhaps there's a message there to say that, get in line. We've had enough of the kind of bruising encounters that the government have had over the last couple of months. But also, as well as, I want to mention Rachel. I mean, Rachel has been a parliamentarian, I think, for 10 years and represented her constituency and the working class movement with great distinction over a decade. And Rachel is very much a kind of calm, considered, organised character. And so I'm in good company, I would say, with Neil, Chris and Rachel. But it's the wrong choice. And I think really what it comes down to, Dalia, is I think you've got to actually look at the heart of the matter, and that is internal party democracy. We've got to be able to be grown up enough to actually have internal debates, disagreements on policy. That's how you govern a country effectively, and you actually come up with policies that can properly transform society. It shouldn't be a case of that it's my way or the highway. It really should be consensus building and a collective, really the sort of thing that the Labour movement was founded on.
Yeah, and it seems like this kind of debate is happening between party democracy and party discipline. And Starmer is obviously coming down very hard line on that question of what he would call party discipline. I mean, are you surprised that he has been this hard line? And why do you think he has been so cutthroat and has been so hostile to not just internal democracy, but also the kinds of positions that the Labour base feel really passionately about?
I'm glad that you said that about the Labour base, because I've got two fantastic CLPs in Clackmannanshire and Dunblane and Falkirk East, and both have been. I spoke to them both as the news, as I came out the Whip's office. They were the first people I spoke with, them and my staff, who have also been absolutely fantastic and so supportive. The grassroots Labour membership, the rank and file membership, are still fiercely anti-austerity. They appreciate the need to do something different, and that means equalising society. And we can only do that with redistribution of power and wealth for the benefit of the many. That is what our movement was founded on. And I'm not going to call them old-fashioned Labour values, but they're real and true Labour values, and they should never go out of fashion. Now, I think that the leadership, as I said earlier on, I think over the last couple of months, especially on welfare, they've felt bruised by what's happened. But what I will say is about myself and the other three colleagues that have been suspended is that initially the welfare bill, I think, was going to cut in the region of £7 billion. Now, in the end, it cut about £2 billion. Now, that is still £2 billion too much. I stand by what I said all along, that the bill should have been withdrawn. But what I will say is, those £5 billion worth there, that basically, that saved lives. Now, that goes to show that there is a cohort within the Parliamentary Labour Party that appreciate the fact that, we need to rally around topics and issues for the benefit of people. So I think it actually shows that the Parliamentary Labour Party, the backbench faction, if you like, that was operating effectively. And I would also say as well is that if they went from 7 billion to 2 billion, then I would say that Rachel Maskell, Neil, Chris, myself, and all the other ones that rebelled, I think it shows that we've been vindicated, really. And that the policy was wrong in its first instance.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't want to sort of keep trying to ask you to enter into the mind of Keir Starmer and tell us what's going on there. But I guess you've had more contact with it than I have, at least. So I'm going to ask you anyway. What I find quite difficult to understand is that it's clear that the rise of reform is a threat to some of the Labour Party base. And what I find deeply confusing is the fact that when it comes to certain issues, such as cuts to disability benefits, this is actually one of the arenas where the Labour base and the reform base are quite together on. I mean, I think it's something like 40% of reform voters are against the cuts to disability. Some are unsure, and a minority of them are for these cuts to disability. So why is it that the Labour Party is not using these points of commonality between the Labour base and a possible reform base in order to pull voters away from what I would say are, the very toxic grasp of a potential reform party?
I would say that the first point that you said there about interactions with the Prime Minister, I've only actually had three, and that is the three PMQs that I've presented to him. So unfortunately, we don't actually have a kind of working personal relationship in that regard. So that is something that I think it'd be fair to say the Prime Minister really needs to address his relationship with backbench MPs. I think a lot of the disagreements that we've seen, I think that they would have been averted if there was that kind of healthier working relationship. In regard to what you said there about Labour base and reform base, I'm glad that you brought that up as well, actually, because in the recent MSP by-election in Hamilton, Larkhall and Stonehouse, on polling day, I finished doing my route for on that run. There was a couple of guys standing outside with a kind of light blue rosette on outside one of the polling booths. We've got to actually speak to these people and hear exactly why have you joined reform. So it's, "Hi guys, how you doing?" Introduce myself. How have you found your home in reform? Tell me more. And I think we've got to have these conversations with people and the two guys that I spoke with, they said, "Look, we voted Labour last summer. We've been let down. The Tories will never do anything for us. We understand that. The SNP in Scotland have been a failure. Every public service we've seen in 2 decades has gotten worse. They've had their own special brand of austerity. So we've suffered kind of double-edged austerity in Scotland." And they said, "We voted Labour because, we wanted change. We gave you a chance." And in the first year, you haven't given us the positive change that we're looking for. So the disenfranchisement, the disillusionment of people, and we can see that disenfranchisement and disillusionment as well when we look at the turnout percentages. We had a local council by-election in the next door constituency to mine in Bannockburn in Stirling district, and I think it was 17% turnout. Now, I realise that is a by-election, they're historically going to be lower, but that shows that not just apathy that people feel, but anger. They're so angry at being let down. They need change, and it was all over our manifesto, but change is not £2 billion worth of cuts to the welfare budget. We have done some good things, and for example, it's only right to focus on these as well, because I'm proud of the Employment Rights Bill. I'm proud of the restoration of the mine workers' pension scheme, and the national minimum wage is good. It wasn't enough, and it wasn't enough when we consider that when we look at energy costs alone. I think last October we saw energy bills go up 10%, and then we saw them go up 1.8%, I think, in January, and then over 6% again in April. Now, that wipes out any benefit of the national minimum wage increase, and that's just for your energy bills, let alone the price of your shopping and your groceries. So we've got to really improve people's living standards. And I know that that's a bit of a buzzword term at the moment, but it's true. That's how every government gets judged on. We've got to make people better off. That means getting away from a decade and a half of wage stagnation and wage suppression that we've seen in austerity. We've got to invest in public services. We've got to address corporate greed. And until we address corporate greed, awful corporate greed, then we're tinkering around the edges of society. And one of the things that I've been talking about in my first year in campaigning hard on has been the introduction of an annual wealth tax. And I've certainly, when I've managed, it must be a compelling argument if I've convinced Neil Kinnock to get behind it. But that goes to show that, people across the party appreciate that we need to actually redistribute power and wealth. And I talk about that a lot. But I feel that when I'm in Parliament, there's a couple of things that just don't, it surprises me, that don't get much of an air, and that is redistribution of power and wealth. And the fact that all our politics and all our societal inequality is based on class. Hardly anyone in Parliament talks about classist issues. And when we see we're the sixth richest economy in the world, but we've got 3 million plus and rising people dependent on 3-day emergency food parcels, there's something far wrong at the heart of our economy. And when we look at that, that's failure of the political class for the working class.
You, alongside 3 other MPs, but also before that, other MPs that have been suspended from the Labour Party, we're seeing an increasing caucus of independent MPs within Parliament. Do you anticipate being able to return to the Labour Party eventually, or do you see yourself probably being in kind of cohort with this increasingly expanding independent MP group?
I still hold on to the belief that the Labour Party is the most likely vehicle for social improvement, economic, cultural and political. I think the infrastructure of the party, and what I will say is there's so many good people, not just the grassroots, the membership and CLPs up and down the country, but there's a cohort of MPs in the Parliamentary Labour Party that are fantastic people. They're trade unionists, they're socialists, they're democratic socialists, that you might label them in any other way, but they're good people that want to see that redistribution of power and wealth and opportunity across society. The base is still there within the Labour Party, and for me, it is still the most likely vehicle to achieve the change in society that we need.